Hello everyone. Today I want to show a very sharp and a tactical game played in the 2003 Linares tournament between former world champion Garry Kasparov and a very young Teimour Radjabov. Let's check it out. Kasparov starts with e4, e6, so we'll go for the French, d4 and d5, knight c3, knight f6 and e5, knight ft7, f4, strengthening the center, c5, undermining white center, and knight to f3. Knight c6, bishop e3, all standard developing moves, and a6. Queen d2, b5, a3, preventing b4, queen b6, and knight to e2, strengthening the d4 square, and also preparing c3 in some cases. c4 by black, closing the position. g4, expanding on the king side. And h5. g takes and rook takes. So clearly black is not going to castle on the king side and would like some activity, some active pieces on the king side in fact. Knight to g3, kicking the rook away, and the rook goes back to h8. f5. So very aggressive play by Kasparov, which is quite typical. He would like to start an attack as soon as possible. E takes f5, knight takes f5, and knight to f6, opening the bishop's attack on the knight on f5. So if let's say e takes f6, you have bishop takes f5. After f takes g7, you have bishop takes g7 and rook g1, bishop f6. This is all fine for both sides. But instead, after knight f6, Kasparov simply went knight to g3. He did not want to exchange any pieces. And knight comes to g4. Bishop f4, not wanting to exchange any pieces, and bishop e6 just developing. c3, strengthening d4. Bishop to e7, black also develops. And knight g5 now, looking to swap a pair of a bishop for a knight. Black simply castles. Knight e6, fe6, and bishop e2. Here, there are a couple of choices. You could go for knight into h2, which is also fine, which would lead to, let's say, knight h5. The knight on h2 is trapped, so it seems you're losing a piece, but there is knight a5 here first, looking to come to b3. So queen e3 first, getting out of the way, and then g6, attacking white's knight. So let's say knight g7 and rook dg8, and you can have a trade of pieces: rook into h2, rook into h2, bishop into h2, and rook into g7. This would be fine for both sides. Another option was simply after bishop e2, knight h6, and white can castle and rook can come to g8. This would also be fine. But Radjabov went for a very a crazy sacrifice, which is not totally accurate, but it is very, very provocative indeed. He played knight g into e5. And here's the point. You have to be very careful here. If, let's say, d takes e5, then there is d4. C takes d4, rook takes d4. If, let's say, queen to c1, then knight a5 is very annoying. Bishop e3, knight b3. Bishop takes d4, queen takes d4 in fact. We're down a rook, but it's okay because after, let's say, queen d1, you have queen e3 and there's a lot of pressure on white's position. There is nothing you can do to stop bishop h4 into g3. And then you will also have knight d4 coming, which will pressure the bishop on e2. So this is quite good for black. We can check out another variation. Let's say after rook d4, if let's say queen e3, then rook f8 comes, puts more pressure on the f4 bishop. Bishop g5, you swap, and queen a5 is killer. There is no decent defense. The king is stuck in the middle of the board. So, but there was one move here that white can play and keep an advantage. Perhaps you can pause the video here and see what Kasparov missed. The move is bishop into e5, because after knight into e5 and d into e5, the best black will have would be bishop c5, trying to create some threats, but bishop g4 gives some counterplay. Let's say bishop e3, simply get out of the way with queen to g2, and this is fine. White will hold this and will enjoy the extra piece. So accepting the sacrifice with the bishop was the correct way, but Kasparov played here, he played queen e3. He perhaps trusted Radjabov's calculation and did not feel comfortable accepting the sacrifice. Knight to d7, just you won a pawn, you go back. Queen into e6, bishop h4, and queen comes back to g4. g5 by Radjabov. Bishop tucks back to d2, and rook d to e8. So at the moment making castling a bit difficult. There was another idea of knight to a5 as well, which is also quite interesting. And if, let's say, you castle, you have bishop takes g3, queen takes g3, queen to g6, b4, c takes, bishop d3, and queen to c6. This was also possible. Knight a5 was an interesting idea. It really infiltrates into white's camp and makes life a little difficult. So this was one way to play, but yeah, rook to e8, also another idea. And white castles, now knight a5. Here it was important to play king b1, so that after knight b3 comes, you have simply bishop f3, you get out of the way of the rook's attack. Let's say rook hf8, defend it with rook hf1. And if knight takes, you take with the rook, and both sides are okay. You can have something like rook h4, queen h5, rook fe8, but rook dd1. And white holds, black is also fine. This would be fine, but after knight a5, Kasparov misjudged the position. He played rook df1. And this leads to, after knight b3, the king forced to come to d1 to defend the bishop on d2. So the rook moving left the bishop undefended. And here, bishop into g3. So you grabbed a piece and you can't immediately capture back, because if h into g3, you have queen g6, threatening queen to b1. So bishop c1, defending that. Queen b1 anyway, threatening to capture. If queen into g5, then knight into c1. And after queen into c1, you have queen e4, putting pressure on e2 and on h1. And white has no way to defend both threats. So after bishop into g3, rook f7 was played, putting pressure on the d7 knight. But simply rook to d8, defending. Queen c6 was also an interesting idea here. And the point being, if let's say bishop into g5, you can play b4, and the queen can infiltrate on a4 and threaten some nasty discovery. So that would force an exchange of queen into d7 and queen into d7, rook into d7, king into d7. Probably that was how it would go. So queen c6 was also a very good idea, but rook d8 is good enough. Bishop takes g5 and queen g6. So there is no time to grab the rook. Queen b1 is a deadly threat, so queen f5 here. Queen takes f5, rook takes f5, and rook d to f8. Rook into f8, knight into f8. It's important to keep the rook on the h file so that the pin remains. This pawn has to be pinned. Bishop f3, defending the rook, and bishop h4. Bishop e3, and we can see that Radjabov is just up a piece. Knight to d7. Bishop takes d5, so you grabbed another pawn, but rook e8. Bishop h6. Knight d takes c5, so if white were to capture, you can simply play rook d8 and grab the piece back. Bishop f7, rook e7, bishop h5, and knight d3. And it was in this position that Garry Kasparov resigned the game, because he's just down a piece. There's nothing more to be done. Black is going to win this, definitely. So very nice victory for Radjabov. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon for the next game.